Welcome to the ninth episode of the 39A podcast. This is Anup Surendranath from Project 39A, and we're a criminal justice program based out of the National Law University in Delhi. In today's episode, we have Dr. Vijay Raghavan with us, who teaches at the Center for Criminology and Justice at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. At TIS Mumbai, Dr. Raghavan also heads the Field Action Project Prayas, which works on custodial rights and rehabilitation of those who come into conflict with the criminal justice system. Thank you, Dr. Raghavan, for joining us today.
Thank you, Anup. It is always a pleasure interacting with you and your team.
Yeah, so today's conversation, Dr. Raghavan, is on prisons and COVID in particular. But before I start that conversation on the particular issue of COVID in prisons, I thought it might be good to have a sort of your sense on prisons in India more generally and how we must understand them as institutions in India. And because I think a lot of that conversation has great bearing on what has happened during the pandemic so far and what we're likely to see. So in that sense, could you just reflect on in our governance systems, how would you characterize the approach to prisons from within government and what is their institutional approach to prisons? I know that's a very broad question, but I think it'd be good to just start off with your thoughts on that and pick up from there.
I would say that if you want to really look at the whole governance system or structure of prisons in India, one will probably have to go to the colonial era because as you are well aware, most of the prisons in our country are still governed by the Prisons Act of 1894, except for 3 or 4 states where they have come up with their own state laws, West Bengal, Kerala, Haryana, Delhi, and I think Punjab is in the making, to the best of my knowledge. All the other states are still following the Prisons Act of 1894, which, as you all know, was legislated for a different purpose. That is what actually dictates how our prisons are governed till today. There have been changes mainly because of the fact that the prison manual that was created first when Dr. Reckless came to India in the 50s. He was a UN correctional expert and a well-known criminologist, American criminologist, Walter C. Reckless. He was invited to India in the post-independence era by the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru in the mid-50s. And the then director of TISS, Dr. J.C. Kumarappa, had a role in bringing him to India. And he, along with another correctional expert called Lord Edward Galloway, they were here for a fairly longish period, I think for almost a year. And they spent more than 6 months of that period during their stay at TISS. This was, I would say, really the period when a lot of work around corrections was getting rewritten. So the first conference of Inspectors General of Prison was held at Tata Institute during this period. After a long gap, the first training program of prison staff, jailers and assistant superintendents, etc., was conducted at TIS during this period. And the first training program for probation officers was also conducted during this period. This also led to the framing of the Probation of Offenders Act, 1958.
Right.
And also the Model Prison Manual, the first Model Prison Manual, the decision to form a committee to draft the Model Prison Manual was taken during this period. So, and I think this has got something to do with the fact that most of our freedom fighters had been to prison. They had probably experienced prison conditions firsthand, and therefore it somewhere came into the priorities of trying to do something to improve the situation of our prisons and custodial institutions. There was also a Gore committee set up to look at the whole issue of aftercare. Dr. M.S. Gore, who was a former director of TIS. So I would say that up from the 50s to the 70s, there was an attempt to improve prison conditions and also to bring in the correctional and the rehabilitation framework somewhere within. So appointment of probation officers, appointment of prison welfare officers, schemes for prisoners' welfare, etc., where somewhere brought in. But my analysis is that the focus on welfare began to change after the 70s. And especially with the Garibi Hatao program launched by Mrs. Gandhi, the focus shifted to a direct attack on poverty. Rather than looking at this whole area of persons who are left behind and need support and welfare measures, it was somehow assumed that if there is a direct attack on poverty through anti-poverty programs, there will not be a need to invest in social welfare. And in that process, the whole emphasis on corrections began to kind of, ebb. And so from the 70s onwards, I see a shift, a tectonic shift in terms of, how our prisons were seen as a subject matter. And this is also the period when the accumulation of under-trials began to really cause serious problems. And then leading up to the period of the early 80s when the police commission went around the country and they saw the horrible conditions in which under-trials were kept. And particularly those articles written by Mr. Rustamji, who was a member of the National Police Commission, which led to, in the Indian Express, which led to the Supreme Court taking suo motu cognizance. And in fact, the history of prison reforms in India is pretty much linked with the history of public interest litigation in India, as you well know, probably more than me. So this is where I would say that since then we have been struggling to somehow, keep up with a problem which keeps burgeoning, and somehow the issues don't seem to go away, despite number of reform committee reports and despite ad hoc attempts made to somehow address the issues from time to time. So we somehow seem to be, going round in circles when it comes to this subject.
In a certain interesting way, there is a certain colonial continuity in terms of the formal legal instruments that govern these spaces.
Yes.
But interesting aspect of what you just spoke about was that there is that moment post-independence, where there is that thinking for a couple of decades.
Yes.
That seeks to undo some of that colonial experience.
Yes.
And yet then there is that lack of governance imperative or focus towards prisons.
Yes.
But fundamentally, as a political perspective on this, just for our listeners, why are prisons not a priority? That's very often asked, right? Why is it, in terms of so many things, in terms of how the prison cadre is created, how it functions, the budgeting, the provisions, just the infrastructure. But I know, again, it's a complicated, long question, but just for our listeners, why do you think it's not a priority?
Yeah, if you just look at the India Justice Report of 2020, and if you look at simple things like vacancies, which is ranging between 30 to 40%, the vacancies in medical posts, doctors and paramedics, the overcrowding situation. All of this is kind of well known and written about. And the second question that comes up is that the solutions to these problems is not rocket science. For anybody who has been working in this field for a significant amount of period would be able to come up with answers which more or less are the same, that you need to, bring about reform in the bail system. You need to improve the legal aid system of the country. you need to bring about decriminalization of laws. I mean, there could be some 5 or 6 such. You need to probably increase the judge population ratio, etc., etc. But why is it not happening? So the first question might be that, resources could be a problem, but my sense is that is not the real issue. Because even if you look at the budget, it is a very small, it's a pittance of the amount that we spend on our criminal justice system, leave alone prisons. On the entire CJS, the percentage of the budget that we spend out of the total GDP or the annual budgeting outlays of the state government and the union government, it's really a very, very small fraction. If that budget was increased even by a smaller amount, it would still lead to pretty larger changes in the system. So for me, the answer lies in the fact that there is no political will. And that, of course, is because prisoners and persons in custody do not constitute vote banks. They are atomized, isolated individuals who have lost the support not only of the community, but sometimes even of their families. And therefore, they don't really matter. The very fact that under the Representation of People's Act, they are not allowed to vote, even if they are under trials. And the funny thing is, once they come out on bail, they can vote. But if they are in prison, they can't vote. I think that in itself speaks something about why things are not changing. And just to add one more point is that especially in the last 20 years across the world, the proliferation of penal populism, where there is a stress towards harsher laws and debunking any theories or practices in the area of rehabilitation. I think these also are factors which have contributed to this process.
So just moving the conversation forward and picking a strand on that here are people and a section of our population who are often not allowed to speak out for themselves in many senses, right? And then there is a lack of interest in speaking out for them, either in any meaningful way from within government or within political parties, and that combines in sort of very strange ways to produce the situation that we are in. But in terms of that governments and parties are able to do this, right? How much of it is also that is a social imagination of prison and prisoners and those accused of crime, right? I mean, it's that sort of, if I could just pick up on that point that you made about people being atomized, that there is a certain social dynamic and social conversation that allows for that atomization and saying that it's okay to ignore them or worse, to treat them even more harshly, and that sort of feeds into all these conversations about why are we spending taxpayers' money on prisons and all of those kinds of conversations. Right? So if I may just be a little provocative and ask you, why should we spend taxpayers' money on prisons? And two, if you could also then reflect on why has social conversation headed in that direction of demonizing that section of population, saying that we really need to, it's almost like a very retributive approach in that social conversation, right? So if you could just speak to both.
So why should one spend on prisons and prisoners? I mean, a simple way to look at this would be, let's look at the population that constitutes prisoners. And our prison statistics India report, as well as the India Justice Report, tell us that, it's 85% belong to the marginalized sections of society. These are Dalits, tribals, minorities, especially Muslims, and OBC communities. So while they see, this is an important thing to understand, that the same person, when he or she or they are out in the community, they are seen as worthy of state support. So you have reservations, you have schemes and programs for persons from all these different communities. But the moment a person has a brush with the law, the identity of the person changes. And so therefore, once you enter the criminal justice system by way of arrest, your social background doesn't seem to matter. And this is also because one has also seen that even in terms of civil society groups and movements which fight for the rights of marginalized communities, whether it is Dalits or tribals or even women for that matter, the moment people go into custody, somehow they are not these very groups tend to invisibilize them. I mean, I don't know of too many women's groups or the women's movement which is fighting for the rights of women prisoners. Right. I don't know of too many Dalit rights groups or movements which is talking about the problems of Dalit prisoners and so on and so forth. So this kind of a demarcation runs through not only the state and state structures, but even in terms of civil society participation.
Interesting. Right. Yeah. I mean, it is pretty much a retributive conversation on crime, isn't it? I mean, absolutely. And there is no other conversation on crime. Right. And I guess that also further aids this process of saying these are people we don't need to care about. Right. That or these are individuals who are a burden on society. Right. So, and before we just jump to the COVID context, is going to be my last question on broader understanding. What is the way forward on this in this sort of really sharp social and political conversation on crime? I mean, unless I think we start sort of blunting those edges and those very sharp edges. There is never going to be any motivation to do the kind of things that we've been discussing about so far.
Very true. I think that it's here that the role of the media becomes very important because they are the ones who are driving these narratives, these mainstream narratives that exist, because every time a heinous crime is committed, the way in which it is reported. So that's one part. Secondly, crimes committed by powerful people, economic offenders, for example, or terrorism-related crimes. The way these kind of crimes get reported, the larger narrative that's getting created is these are criminals who do not deserve any kind of sympathy. They don't deserve any kind of humane treatment. And also, I think as a society, we still continue to hold the retributive angle more than anything else. While when it comes to theory, we may have moved from retribution to rehabilitation, but in practice somehow, and one classic example is every time a heinous crime is committed, especially crime against women, you find the kind of responses from the public. For example, the Hyderabad encounter case, and how those policemen were eulogized by one and all, including in the social media in a big way. So that kind of tells us something about what are our thoughts on. And I think there is a sense of lack of understanding as well as helplessness in the larger community about how does one deal with crime. And I think the reason for that is an absence of a more nuanced discussion on what is the way forward. I mean, so one needs to probably categorize people in crime into like, for example, the fact that a significant proportion of persons in prison are arrested for offenses which are really not the serious ones, and even if they are the serious ones, they are more failure of or breakdown of relationships rather than cold-blooded, planned kind of killings that takes place. But unfortunately, this story never comes to the center stage. And I think that's where, I think the way forward is there. I mean, we need to have more and more conversations. We need to have more of reporting, maybe even making a lot of audiovisual material which can reach the public to somehow try and change this narrative. But it's a very tough ask.
That's right. And I think even talking of the reformative aspect of it, I think, and of course you've worked in this space a lot longer than I have, but I think even the little experience that I've had, I think there's such a little disjunct between the stated goals of the system in terms of being reformation, right, and the sort of actual practices inside prison, right, which is still a institution of discipline in that sense.
Absolutely.
Right? It's where you are taught in that with all that comes with that kind of teaching, right? Where you're taught to be disciplined, to walk the line in that sense, right? And the stated goals never translate into the daily practices inside prison, right? And therefore, then you're wondering about what kind of experiences are people having inside prison, and what is the impact of that experience on them when they do get out of prison and go back into society. And again, it feeds back into that loop about is it even a priority to think about reformation in any meaningful way and invest in it, right? So now, just moving on to the COVID context, and I just thought all of this was important for the COVID conversation as well, because I think so much of it has bearing on all that we have been seeing on prisons, and I guess we will continue seeing. And I think for me, the first thing was how little we know, right? And it's so true of prisons as an institution, and as you said, we have an idea of what things are like, for what are people getting in, how long do they stay in prison. But there is a lot of very basic things that we should know about the institution that is prisons that we do not know, right?
Correct.
And I just felt that insularity was just exacerbated during COVID, right?
Absolutely,
we knew even less, right? The usual people who were allowed to go in and through which information might have been gathered and collated was just not happening. What did you think of how much information was coming out, and how much of it do we really know of what happened, of what the pandemic was like inside India's prisons?
Very true. Yeah, you're absolutely right, because whatever little transparency that was there by way of members of civil society organizations or volunteers or legal aid lawyers visiting the prison, or even private lawyers for that matter, the pandemic put a complete stop to all of that. So no outsider was allowed inside. Legal aid lawyers were allowed, but they themselves were struggling for livelihood during the pandemic period, and our experience shows that they simply vanished when it comes to the legal aid services are concerned, because they were more worried about their own daily life security, and they just were not available. So therefore, the only access that prisoners had to the outside world was, through the phone calls and video calls, which was allowed as a result of the suspension of the mulaqats, the physical interviews. And so we do know that, here again, the question is whether everyone was allowed equal access, because there is no way one can know for certainty whether this happened or not. But one does know of cases through our work where people were allowed to, prisoners were allowed to speak to their family members. In fact, even in terms of some of the foreign prisoners, women particularly in Baikala jail, we actually got requests from the prison authorities to call up their relatives abroad who were very worried about the situation in India. So apart from this, exactly what was the situation inside, the only way to know about it was through the court affidavits that various prison departments across the country, they had to file because, as you know, there was a slew of public interest litigations that were filed suo motu as well as by public spirited citizens in different states on this issue. And the state did have to respond. I mean, for example, I am aware of one such PIL which is currently going on in the Bombay High Court, where I've been assisting the court. And there's a lot of information that has come by way of affidavits and data submitted by the government to the court. So other than that, there is no third-party kind of oversight. Here again, I would say that the role that the state commissions could have played, or the national commissions could have played, Human Rights Commission, Women's Commission, they also were absent in action.
I mean, I've been trying to wonder, do we have a sense of what the rate of testing was inside compared to what the rate of testing was outside? I mean, do we have enough information to even start to understand whether practices inside were at par and what was, I mean, overall, of course, the situation was terrible generally. But do we have any metric to start to understand if the situation and the kind of measures that were adopted inside were almost the same as what was outside prison, or was it worse, or don't we just know enough to make that assessment?
Actually, I have I've written a paper on COVID and prisons in an academic journal, in which I try to argue that whatever steps were taken with regard to prisoners, the motive didn't come across that the motive was to really concern about their health condition. But the motive was to ensure that it didn't spread outside, that they didn't become carriers. The motive was that there shouldn't be a situation where there are too many deaths, which will create huge problems for the system in terms of criticism from civil society and other groups. And the motive was to somehow keep the disease under control. So basically, the emphasis was on management of the disease. And here again, it was the same panopticon methods of surveillance, partitioning, and segregation that were used. For example, creating the quarantine prisons, these temporary prisons to quarantine freshly admitted prisoners. But one heard that the living conditions in these temporary prisons was not good at all. From media reports, So again, the focus was not to so much ensure that minimum standards are maintained, but the focus was to somehow control the disease. In terms of testing, the question that you asked, again, going by data that is submitted to the court, at least in Maharashtra, the numbers seemed quite impressive. I mean, last time this was a month ago, apparently some 66,000 RT-PCR tests were conducted when the prison population is about 30,000 plus at any given point of time. But this again cannot be generalized because we need to look at the situation state by state. And one source of data which listeners might be interested to go to is the tracker which has been put in place by the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative on COVID in prisons, which is available online, which gives up-to-date data, whatever is publicly available, on number of people who have tested positive, prisoners as well as staff, number of people who died, number of vaccinations that have taken place, etc.
And if you could just state the journal and the paper.
So it's in the International Journal on Social and Economic Development. It's an open access journal. And the article is called Prisons and the Pandemic, the Panopticon Plays Out. So I think if you just Google my name and the article name, you'll get the link because it's an open access journal.
Fantastic.
I've also compared in terms of the response of COVID to in other parts of the world. It's not just looking at India, but in other parts of the world. And there seem to be pretty much a lot of similarities.
So I want to just pick up on a broader thematic concern I had, and it ties into this what you spoke about as to what really was motivating the various measures undertaken in prisons to deal with the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I just felt that from early on, and I think I guess it was commendable that one of the first issues that was picked up in courts during the pandemic early last year was prisons, right? I mean, there's something. I think there is something to be said about that. Despite all the discussion we've been having today, I thought that was quite encouraging.
Right.
With the setting up of the high-powered committees and all of that. But on reflection, Dr. Raghavan, could we have framed it as a right to health issue rather than framing it as a decongestion issue? I mean, would that to just maybe tease out some of the consequences of that distinction, right? Of what happened as a result of framing it as a decongestion issue rather than framing it as a right to health of prisoners issue. But maybe we could just reflect on that distinction.
Yeah, I mean, there are no two ways about the point that you're making. And in fact, that's what I've tried to argue in the paper also, that like I said, it was seen more as a management issue. How does one manage the prisons in the pandemic rather than what are their basic? And one very clear example of this is the manner in which the high-powered committees across the country identified categories of prisoners who could be considered for release on temporary bail or emergency parole. And almost all of them took those decisions on the basis of the offense category rather than on health grounds. So they refused to look at, in fact, there were a couple of cases that we were trying to get temporary bail who were arrested. One was arrested in a Makoka case, which is an organized crime case, who had like a 50% disability. And another was a lady who was very, very ill with some blood disorder and also used to have epileptic fits. And she was arrested in a drug-related case, NDPS matter. And in both these cases, the courts refused to grant bail, whereas they were fit cases considering the risk to their, life. And in fact, the recent, passing away of Father Stan Swami again highlights the same point, that it was not, that it was, the health grounds were not really considered. It was more the offense for which the person was arrested. That was primary in the minds of our judges, which is, I think, was not the best way to deal with the issue.
And true, the entire governance logic, I don't think was driven by how vulnerable certain prisoners might be due to their own comorbidities or what other physical conditions. Right? And then it seems to have been again a very retributive approach to this whole thing, right? I mean, saying that we're going to just look at offenses based on what punishments are possible, and then create those categories. And I just thought it just defied logic, given that we were dealing with a public health emergency in that sense. In terms of just the ability of prisons to handle this, I mean, I think there are very micro infrastructure consequences that are tied to the larger conversations on budgets for prisons. Right? And clearly this was a resource-intensive emergency. How do you think, again, I guess it's difficult to do these all-India picture assessments in a short time like this. But again, is it one of those issues where the larger sort of lack of priority in budgeting has had a very serious consequence on the right to health of prisoners?
Yes. I would say that, the pandemic really exacerbated the infrastructure and the human resource constraints within the prison system. So when I spoke about the fact that there are about 30 to 40% vacancies in prison departments across the country, imagine the fact that there is already a huge pressure on them, and because of COVID, they had to sometimes quarantine themselves as well. So, for example, in Maharashtra, the main central prisons in Mumbai, Thane, Pune, etc., they were under lockdown, which meant that the staff had to stay inside the prison for periods as long as 15 days and more. And so they had no contact with their families and continuously on duty. Right. And this is because we did not have spare staff to spare and people taking shifts and on rotation basis. Similarly, when it comes to health facilities, we all know that the situation of healthcare in prisons is pretty appalling. And so that got exacerbated again. And so therefore, basically, I would say that given the fact that there were so many constraints, I'm surprised with the fact that any major disaster hasn't taken place so far in terms of deaths or a very high positivity rate. It started like that in 2020, in somewhere in the month of May, when, for example, in Arthur Road, some 150 people tested positive, but then somehow slowly the situation was brought under control. To that extent, I would say that the existing people who were working in the system, they have somehow been able to manage a situation, but I'm sure there has been a heavy cost to pay for it. Yeah.
So obviously then the high-powered committees created these categories of offenses. If you were under that category, you were entitled, you were identified as being eligible in that sense for emergency bail and or parole, and you could apply for that. And there was a process to be followed in giving you that emergency bail or parole. But I think, and I just want to take then the conversation to the larger point of what about those who did fall into these categories, right? Right. And then the near total suspension
of the courts
of court functioning on normal bail questions. Who did fall into these categories who were eligible for emergency bail or parole. So you are not having your regular bail hearings. Your trials are not happening. Right. And then you're struggling to keep the judicial infrastructure going. And therefore you don't. And again, you have that conundrum where you're releasing people, but you also seem to be bringing in a lot of people. Right. And sending a lot more people to prison. So, and now we're almost 17 months into 16 months into the pandemic. And we are very far from the judicial system and the legal system, sort of the wheels starting to move again.
Very true.
So what do we do of this population, right, who are not entitled under this framework that we've developed to get out, but neither do they have access to the whatever, for the lack of a better word, a normal legal system. What is the way out?
No, it's a travesty of justice as far as these people are concerned, because like you said, categories of prisoners who were to be considered as eligible, ultimately it was the trial court judge or the magistrate who had to take a call. And if you look at data, when these categories were worked out, the HPC had anticipated, I'm talking of Maharashtra, that's where I know more. The HPC had anticipated 17,500 prisoners would get released. And that would reduce the prison population by 50%. So Maharashtra, for example, has a official capacity of holding 23,000 prisoners. So it would have come down to 17,500, which would have made social distancing also like a possibility. But ultimately, only about 10,000 were released. And when we did an analysis, in fact, through our team members of what was happening, we found that a lot of bail applications were either kept pending or they were rejected, despite the fact that they were considered eligible. Reasons for cases kept pending were case papers were not found on time because there was staff shortage in the courts because they were working at 30% as per COVID restrictions. The public prosecutor's say was not available on the day the bail hearing took place. or the magistrate, because the judges were also sitting in court in turns. So on that particular day, the magistrate or the judge was not there. So the additional judge or magistrate said, I am not going to decide in this matter. Let the regular judge or magistrate come and take this matter. And then there were equal number of cases that were rejected. Bail was rejected because documents are not there, or, you know, citizenship proof documents are not there, or they were treating it like a regular bail matter. They were not really treating it as a corona bail, which is how it's popularly known. And so the purpose for which the HPC created those categories to some extent did get defeated and frustrated. So this is one. Second is those who have been denied the possibility of being even considered for bail. Like there may be people who are seriously ill, or maybe a lot of people facing mental health issues. I mean, my hunch is that mental health problems must have gone up significantly during these last 60 months, because you are dealing with prisoners whose cases are at a standstill. Trials have stopped. Their regular bail hearings are not taking place. Physical mulaqats are stopped. Entry of organizations and NGOs into the system is stopped. Imagine, therefore, in what mental condition and state many of these prisoners
and on that, if the medical facilities in prison themselves tell an abysmal story, within that medical facility story is the even worse story of mental health facilities, right?
Absolutely.
And one just wonders what has happened on that front. I just want to end with two broader questions.
Yes.
Right? One is the use of technology, right? Right, and I think that's also a larger socio-political conversation on how technology is almost perceived as a panacea for almost everything, without really understanding its social context, its cultural context, and then how technology itself can exclude. Right.
Absolutely.
Right. And now in the prison context, as you earlier alluded to as well, that critical aspect of a mulaqat, right, is now converted into a technological
solution.
Avenue, right? Is a solution. Right. And it's not very difficult to see why telling people that they need to call on a phone with a sufficient, it has to be a smartphone, it has to have a certain amount of connectivity, it has to have, you have to be able to buy data, right? And is also an exclusion, right? I mean, and you can see that in so many different ways, in education,
absolutely.
Right? So do you fear that now this is here to stay? In that sense, right? We've now let this out. We've let the genie out of the bottle in that sense. And now you might say, why do we need to have, or at least have more and more adoption of these technologies where you're saying you don't really need to come all the way. And it is for your own good that you don't need to come all the way. But there is another story to this, isn't it? I mean, letting people come and meet people.
Right. No, in fact, I have two things to say about this. One is that at least thanks to this technology, there wasn't a complete breakdown with family ties. So that is something that I want to kind of acknowledge, that thanks to the fact that these video calls or phone calls, PCOs were available, prisoners could at least contact their family members, talk to them, etc., etc. But already, even before the pandemic, there are many states which are now have started facilities like phone calls and video mulaqats through video conferencing, and e-mulaqat and online booking of mulaqat slots. In fact, Prayas, we did a study on this last year. The report was brought out last year, but the study was done before the pandemic. Looking at the situation of some of the best practices in terms of improving Mulakat facilities. And so there have been some significant and good, practices that have been initiated in this regard. My sense is that I don't think physical mulakats will stop once the pandemic situation, becomes better, because it's like, we are signatories to the Mandela rules, and it's part of our prison manuals historically as well. So I don't think it's going to go away, but it's possible that technology we might reach a situation where physical mulakats would be less, and more people, even for family members, particularly those who come from difficult family backgrounds, or where it's expensive to travel all the way to come and meet a family member. They might end up using phone calls to keep in touch, which may be more convenient for family members, but it may have a negative impact as far as the prisoner is concerned. Actually, this is one story where the technology part can have two sides. But when you look at the way technology has been used to hold, say, virtual court hearings, you clearly see the digital divide, where a lot of lawyers who do not have good access to technology, internet, connectivity, they were not able to participate in this process as well as some of the better lawyers coming from better off situations. And so while the high court hearings seem to be like a game changer in terms of virtual hearings, etc., but the local courts, things have not really changed. So technology is not necessarily able to bridge the divide, because the divide, I think, is too huge.
Even with technology, even the points that you were making, I don't think anyone is making the argument that we should not adopt technology.
Correct.
But the idea that technology does have exclusionary impact.
No doubt about that. Yeah.
And that while adopting technology, particular attention must be paid to mitigate those exclusionary aspects is just as critical, right?
Yes.
So even if you say that we are going to adopt technology, right? You also have to then say, okay, what does adopting this do, right?
Correct.
And if it's going to exclude people in certain ways, what are our solutions to those exclusionary consequences? Correct. But my last question is this, Dr. Raghavan, in terms of, I feel that, the conversation on prisons is that we just don't know enough, right? And we don't know accurately enough, right? And there are very critical foundational pieces of information that we need to push the conversation forward, right? Otherwise, we are constantly stuck in this. It's convenient to ignore prisons when you don't have to confront that kind of reality, right? But what is the way forward in terms of saying that looking at prisons can't just exclusively be the function of government, right? It's that even as you were saying that in the Bombay High Court proceedings, that the government is producing data, I would think it should also be independently verifiable, right? But we are very far from that. We're very far from that. Do you see that changing? I know there were sort of these the prison visiting committees that were formed, and that has its own story of what has happened to that. So it seems to be this really terrible combination of lack of it not being a sufficient priority in governance, plus a high degree of insularity. And these two combine to make it a very dark, secret world in that sense. But do you have in your many, many years of experience, I'm sure you've seen the needle move a little bit or quite a bit. But what is the way forward? Is there, what are some of the smaller things that we should be able to do?
So, I at least based on what our experience has been, I mean, the only way forward is for the state and civil society to acknowledge each other's contribution and need to collaborate with each other. Because as long as, you see these places as, places where you need to securitize them, then your security concern becomes your priority. So if there is, for example, a researcher who wants to, carry out a very useful piece of research, and let's say, suppose somebody wants to look at, I'm just for the sake of provocation, I'm saying, why do men rape? Okay. Because, that seems to pretty much be a conversation that's happening all the time about, these cruel men who are, going around raping women. If you want to do a study on that, you need access to people who may have committed such offenses. But the problem with our country right now is that the security aspects are overriding the research as well as the reform and rehab agenda of our prisons. And so you're constantly confronted with dealing with officials who look at you with either suspicion or with disdain, as people who are, I was told by not here, not in Maharashtra, but in another state, by a Director General of Prisons, that you people see prisoners as exhibits. And so prison is not a place where, you can come and do your experiments. And I just didn't know where to start, in terms of responding to this kind of impression. You also have circulars issued by the Ministry of Home Affairs, which was done in 2016 after that BBC documentary on this
India's Daughter.
India's Daughter, and that circular, it's not a circular, it's an advisory, which says that ordinarily outsiders should not be given permission, whether they are researchers, whether they are media people, whether they are NGOs, etc. Yeah. So unless we recognize that, there is some, it's not as if the people who are running our prisons or the state knows everything about everything. I mean, there is something that is there to contribute. And I think the best model I can think of is the UK model of the Home Office Research Unit, where, the Home Department actively collaborates with academia, and they drive the research agenda, and policies are influenced by the findings of those, researchers. So, and for that to change, I think at the end of the day, who are there in our prisons, I think that story has to first change. Because then only I think some of these other changes will take place.
Right.
Yeah, but it's a long, hard struggle. But one is not left without hope at the same time.
But I'm sure you've seen the needle move at least somewhat.
It has. In
your years and years of work.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. And there have always been officers who've come along who have done their bit to change things bit by bit.
Right. And I guess that's in essence a challenge, isn't it? How do we move from that very individual dependent, that we're depending on the good senses of certain officers, to a more institutional culture.
Yes.
Right. And
in fact, I was just going to end by saying that one also feels rather tired and exhausted. That constantly having to prove one's credentials instead of moving on,
and one's good faith. One is constantly shown. No. So Dr. Raghavan, thank you so much. I mean, not just for this interview, but I guess for the incredible work that you've done at this in this area, and has shown us so much and taught all of us so much about this very neglected, ignored, and dark space. And I guess, as you cited the Nelson Mandela rules on treatment of prisoners, I guess it's only apt to end with what Nelson Mandela said, that, if you really want to know about a nation, all that you need to do is go and look inside its jails, right?
Yes,
absolutely. And it's not by how you judge its highest citizens, but it's
Yes.
lowest ones that a country must be judged, right? And
yes, Anup. Anup, I just want to add that it's an equal pleasure to interact with you, and the significant body of work which you have created in the last few years, particularly your work on death penalty. I really feel humbled with that kind of work.
Yeah. Thank you. Means a lot coming from you, Doctor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks for your time.